This week we begin our poetry unit. Poetry is meant to be read and listened to. I encourage you to read the poem by Gwendolyn Brooks, A Bronzeville Mother Loiters in Mississippi, Meanwhile, a Mississippi Mother Burns Bacon, and watch it being performed by the actress Ruby Dee. You can find a link to both right here on our Blackboard page under Readings. For discussion forum 7, please choose one stanza. A stanza is a poetic paragraph, and analyze it closely. There is an example from a different poem about how to do this here in discussion forum 7. And journal 6 is your final journal, your final dialectical journal about the last few chapters of Behold the Dreamers. You also have the third quiz, which is the final quiz we will have about Behold the Dreamers. The rest of this video is going to give you some information about Gwendolyn Brooks and the poem by Brooks that we will be focusing on for the next few weeks. Gwendolyn Brooks is a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet and a former poet laureate. She is noted for the formal rigor of her poetry and for her engagement in the social issues of her time. You can read more about Gwendolyn Brooks here. While many poets write about themselves and place themselves as narrator, Brooks did not usually do this. She inhabited many different voices in her poetry. In her poem, A Bronzeville Mother Loiters in Mississippi, Meanwhile, a Mississippi Mother Burns Bacon, Brooks chooses to give a voice to Carolyn Bryant, who is the wife of a white supremacist who was on trial for murdering a black child named Emmett Till in the late 1950s. It was Carolyn Bryant herself who initiated the violent acts that resulted in Till's brutal murder. She accused the 14-year-old boy of whistling at her. This is a claim that she recanted decades later. In retaliation, her husband, Roy Bryant, and his brother, John Milam, kidnapped, tortured, and murdered Till. The men were arrested, and there was a trial in Mississippi that received international media attention. Despite overwhelming evidence that they had murdered Till, Bryant and Milam were exonerated by the all-white jury. The entire world was shocked and horrified at this verdict. Months later, Bryant and Milam admitted in an article for Look magazine that they had murdered Till. They were never punished for their crimes. Till's murder and the sham trial of Bryant and Milam is often credited as inspiring such outrage that it sparked the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Many poets, journalists, musicians, and artists created works about Till. Only Gwendolyn Brooks wrote a poem from the perspective of Carolyn Bryant. This was a bold move. As you read the poem, pay attention to how Brooks characterizes Carolyn Bryant and the allusions Brooks makes. In particular, she uses the ballad form. You can read more about the ballad form here. And alludes to fairy tales. In this way, Brooks demonstrates that Bryant learned her racism from the dominant culture. Bryant was taught that black boys were dangerous and that her husband's job was to protect them. So going back to the poem, if I can get back to my Microsoft Word, by embodying Carolyn Bryant, Brooks does not give her readers an easy way out. The murder was more than a brutal act of violence by two cruel men. This poem clarifies that the murder was a result of an entrenched racist ideology that was taught in schools and reinforced by the dominant culture. Brooks emphasizes that racism and the violence it creates is a deeply embedded problem. Brooks also centered the poem around two mothers. The Bronzeville mother refers to Mamie Till, Emmett's mother. Bronzeville is the middle-class black neighborhood in Chicago where Brooks was raised and where Emmett and Mamie lived. In this way, Brooks also proves the horrific impact that racism has on all children. For example, the fine prince, which is Carolyn Bryant's husband, leaned across the table and slapped the small and smiling criminal. This is Carolyn and Roy's son, who had just thrown a pitcher of molasses at his younger sibling. She did not speak. When the hand came down and away, and she could look at her child, at her baby child, she could think only of blood. Surely her baby's cheek had disappeared, and in its place surely hung a heaviness, a lengthening red, a red that had no end. She shook her head. It was not true, of course. It was not true at all. The child's face was, as always, the color of the paste in her paste jar. 1. Carolyn Bryant hallucinates that her child is bleeding. In this way, she realizes that the violence will not stop with one child. It will permeate everything. I encourage you to read this poem and spend a lot of time in one stanza. Actually, I think rather disturbing, but also the way that it's written with so many different allusions and different characterizations can make it a little bit difficult to understand. So I encourage you to go slowly and spend some time with it. And if you can, watch it being performed by the actress Ruby Dee. It gives a whole different perspective to the poem. And as always, reach out to me via email if you wanted to ask any questions or to set up an appointment for a Zoom, Collaborate, or phone conference. Have a great week, everyone.